That's right.
Good evening, everyone. Oh my gosh, it's so exciting to be back. We're doing lots of things tonight, but one of the things we're doing is debuting our cheeky baby. Yes, yes, the cheeky natives had a baby. And also, this is our first kind of event this year. So, Jarred, we're really honored that you have graced us with your presence today. And we're so excited. Hey, Dr. A.
Hi, everybody, and it's so exciting. Hello to our cheeky baby. Hi, and we're super excited. I think it's such a beautiful way to begin with Jarred Thompson and his amazing debut. And I'm really excited for today's conversation. And Jarred, I have lots of feelings about lots of people in this book, and we're gonna have to talk about the ending. We are. Mm.
Ooh, okay, we're gonna get into this ending.
All right. So, Jarred Thompson is a literary and cultural studies researcher and educator and works as a lecturer in the English department at the University of Pretoria. He was the winner of the 2020 Afro Tundo Prize and has been the recipient of several prestigious scholarships, including the Global Excellence and Statute Scholarship, the Chris van Wyk Creative Writing Scholarship, two National Arts Council grants, and an NRF NGAP scholarship. The Institute of Creative Dying is his first novel. Welcome, Jarred.
Welcome to the
I'm so chuffed to be like the first author of this year to be on the Cheeky Ladies. Thank
Yeah.
you, and the inaugural. Oh my word, yeah, no. Thank you guys for
So
spoiling me.
I must actually say this, right? So when I first read the title, The Institute of Creative Dying, I was assuming that it's about like, novels or some literary dying, right? Um,
Mm.
and I was pleasantly surprised, like when I read the book, that it wasn't some literary dying. So I suppose I want to start here, like tell us about the title, right? So how did the title kind of come about?
It's funny because at UP, the head of my department also thought that, oh, it was a campus novel when she saw the title. So it's funny also that like that is echoing. But the actual title came from a lecture that I was listening to. I was getting interested in sort of Eastern philosophy and esotericism. Um, Listening to thinkers like Alan Watts and Ram Dass. And so there's this point in one of Alan Watts's lectures where he says, "Oh, what if there was a hospital for delightful dying?" And he throws around different terms for what it might be called. And he's like, "Oh, well, in the modern day, they'll probably call it an institute for creative dying." And he says it as kind of like a tongue-in-cheek kind of joke, and the audience laughs. I was like, "Oh, well, that's such a provocative like title." And at the time, I was really sort of resonating with the kinds of things that he was saying. And I was like, "Oh, well." While writing the proposal for the novel, I was like, this is, I mean, it captures everything that I want the place to be about. And it piques interest as well. So I was like, like the title was just calling out to be used when I heard it. So I was like, I'm going to take it. Yeah.
Love it. And I think that's a really good way to segue into the questions around the form and some stylistic choices that you made with the book. So one of them being the fact that the book moves between five characters, and then you have what is like a narrator almost, right? So there's
Mm.
objective narrator, third person who is almost objective, and then of course we get Angelique and company, then giving us the rest. And I'm curious about why you chose to do a multi-person character, right? A multi-person viewpoint. So I think that's extremely challenging because you have
Mm.
to write about the interior lives of five different people. So why did
Mm.
you do that and then contrast it with this what seems to be this objective voice? It's very detached from the happenings, but it's also in many ways much more honest than some of the
Mm.
characters.
Yeah, the third person omniscient, it didn't start out that way. I think I initially wanted just different perspectives, and I wanted to include like the Mustafa and the Mortician having a perspective as well. And I think wanting to do that, it stemmed from my admiration of previous writers who did it so successfully. Kay Selodeka does it in The Quiet Violence of Dreams. William Faulkner does it in As I Lay Dying. And there's another American Southern novel called Getting My Body, who also plays with this kind of multi-perspective narrative. And I've always admired writers who've done that, and I've always enjoyed narratives that have done that. So I think I wanted to challenge myself to see if I could to do that in one longer work. Because I started out writing short stories, so I'd always have to immerse myself in a new character's life with a new short story. So this was kind of like taking those short story skills and kind of just like trying to expand them into novel form. And a lot of the times when I wrote the chapters, I would say to myself, okay, think of this as a short story. Approach it like you're writing a short story for this character, and how would you approach it now for each of the chapters? And then with the way the third person emerged was in my workshopping with other writers, workshopping the various chapters with other writers, and at times the kind of language, the kind of descriptions, the kind of, you could say, like metaphysical philosophies or like analogies or just observations of patterns in the world that I wanted to bring into the story, it was feeling kind of like contrived when it was attached to a particular character or forced in the way the characters were speaking to each other. So it was suggested to me that I just try to write a third person, like a part of the novel in third person. So I tried it, and I found that it freed me from worrying about the characters. I couldn't then worry about the world, the environment, and making these kind of poetic connections between things that I felt resonated with the Mortician and Mustafa's own philosophies. So it was kind of a way to put their philosophies in the omnipotent narrator without having them just force it on the reader or force it in dialogue, if that makes sense. So it freed me in that sense. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I really like what you say, because I think that it kind of also came through, right? It's quite interesting because when you said you used the short story skills in order to write this novel, I was like, it does feel like the chapters, right, in themselves are a story. So even if you were only to read that story singularly, like it would be a short story. So I thought that was really brilliant. I suppose we spoke about kind of the inspiration of the title of the book, but what we didn't speak about is essentially what is the motive, right? What kind of inspired you to start beginning to think about creative dying? Because we'll go into a little bit about what the novel actually is about and what happens in there. But I was really interested in Simpue Gloria Ndlovu says this is everything that a great and impactful debut novel should be: brilliant, daring, and ambitious. And Alma and I, in conversation, were talking about how ambitious this novel is. And so on the one hand, I wanted to speak about the inspiration of the book, right? But I wanted to speak about this idea of ambition. Because in many instances, what writers often do is when they become ambitious, especially in their debut novel or debut offering, what happens is they may lose some of the readership because of the kind of daring work that they're seeking to do in this novel. And I feel like your novel is that. It's like this ambitious, really like deep diving type of meditation. And so what was the inspiration around kind of the book, but also the decision about writing such an ambitious book, kind of put against the idea of maybe potentially losing certain readership?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I've always written stories that had to capture me first, that had to stoke an interest in me, and then the kind of worrying about how it would be received later came after the fact. And I think in a lot of ways the book was also writing towards myself, towards my own life experience, and kind of me, a kind of meditation of me trying to figure out things. So in my lived experience, sort of coming face to face with death, with family members dying, but with also getting sick and recovering, or getting illnesses or getting injuries when I used to play sport competitively, and having your body fail you in different ways. That interests me, but also the different shifts that my own spirituality took, from Catholicism to atheism to an interest in Eastern philosophy to a kind of like vibrant materialism, which I now subscribe to, kind of thinking that the material is also spiritual. Like I was trying to, I guess, write a tome to what I believe now after everything that I've experienced with death, with my different metaphysical disavowals that I've had. And yeah, I think I've never really thought about if it would alienate readers. I think I just wanted to write something as true and as authentic to how I saw the world, or to how I saw different people interacting with each other in the world, and the different patterns that I felt resonated with me, whether it's the pattern of your microbiome, for example, in your gut, and how that might, how the poetic significance of that might translate to you seeing the world differently. And I think, you could say that, the novel is deeply philosophical. I think it does come from my interest in philosophy and how philosophy can shift the way you see the world. So I wanted to write a novel that could at least try or attempt to do that, but also not making the characters feel like, making the characters seem relatable, like characters that you would meet, so that both the heavy lyricism perhaps of some of the sections might be balanced with a very grounded experience of people's lives. So trying to balance those two things was important to me, so that I wouldn't maybe alienate readers too much with the kind of esotericism or metaphysical meanderings or reflections that I undertake in the book. Yeah. And then it also stemmed from a large part stemmed from my own interest in indigenous medicine. So like the revival in psychedelic medicine that is currently happening, my own experiences in imbibing in psychedelic medicine and how it's transformed my life. So I wanted to explore what this revival might mean, and how psychedelic medicine could be used, or even limit experiences, because I also have a interest in the different kind of limit experiences where your sense of self dissolves, and a lot of the techniques in the institute try to stoke that. And then while researching the novel, I came across different research where these different living experiences were being used to help people near the end of their life. So like there'd be research on terminal patients, for example, taking psychedelic therapy. And after that therapy, having a sense of being reconciled to the fact that their life is ending. So I was interested in these connections between the kind of psychedelia that is reviving now, and the benefits, the physiological, the psychological benefits that people have been noticing. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, Jarred, that you've spoken about end of life and sort of the blurring, right, of the veil, so between this life and the next, or what awaits in the next. And I think that for me has been an interesting sort of theme that runs throughout the book, and I think that's something that I wanted to speak a little bit about, and that is the meditation on mortality, right? But not just mortality as what we think of, oh, you live or you die, but you've spoken to it a little bit around the ecosystem. So just how even in nature things die and go back, and there is a cycle that takes place, almost the circle of life. But there's an interesting meditation that you do on on mortality in the physical and otherwise. So the death of ego, the death of ideals. We see people shred their ideas of what they think things should be, or what they think, how they think things should be. And there's almost a blurring of the lines, right, between what things should be and what they are. And I wanted us to just chat a little bit about why you felt that it was so important to speak about mortality, not only just in the physical and in what would, of course, be easy to think of, end of life, people dying, but to think about the death of other things, right? Death of beliefs, death of ego. I mean, that's a huge theme that comes up, but also just the death of relationships, and that's something very interesting to consider.
Yeah, with the death of like ideals and different attachments to the world, I think it stemmed from my own interest in attachment, for example, and the way in which people attach to like worldviews and ideals, but also thinking about how, like throughout the book, there's a sense of like, how do you transform? How do you let go of a belief that has held up your world, but that is also debilitating you? And I think a lot of my influence also came from Lauren Ballant's Cruel Optimism, which is a really formative work for me. And in that, she talks about this kind of thing of holding to beliefs that can be debilitating. And so how do we set up these, she calls it transformational infrastructures, but how do we set up these moments of transformation where we could shift things or shift our relationships, or how we imagine intimacy, or how we imagine what we believe, or how we imagine our relationship to social media, for example, in Angelique's case. So it was also interesting to see the way death, when I was writing, how death wasn't just in the physical, but was both in the relationships that were breaking down, but also in, for example, someone like Diane, whose experience of going through like this clash of sort of different religions and African spirituality coming into the school where she works, and that kind of shaking her up, having that kind of push against what she thought was true, or what she held to. So I was interested, what kind of negotiations do different characters go through when that happens? Or like, what do they reach for in order to show up their world? And I think it did stem from a lot from, at the time, reading a lot of Buddhist literature, and like the sense of, okay, the ego, the ego is bad, desire leads to suffering, and you should let go. But it seems like something, but it's not always so simple. It's more easy to say and less easy to do. And there's all these things. There's moments where you do have to set up boundaries, and letting everything in isn't always good. And I think part of that is why I wanted to write a kind of crime or violence that happened in the novel, where the institute itself has to put up a boundary, has to defend itself, in the sense that you can't just always have your boundaries down and let everything go. There is moments where you have to stand up for something. And a lot of the times it is about like grieving for the different versions of yourself that you are always bound to lose, and you can't hold on, you can't not hold on. It's this catch-22 that you're in, that's always asking you to shift and to let go different versions of yourself. Even, I mean, you may not even be aware that you are letting go, but you make certain concessions little by little, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's in, I won't go to church this week, maybe I'll go to church next month. Little concessions that push you to just shift on your axis, and you slowly over time become a different person. So that happens both physically, but I think it also happens in your worldviews, in your relationships, and tracking that for the characters was beautiful in a way for me. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting that you say that, because I think also what's really powerful about the novel is, the fragility of life. Because for many of the characters, as you've stated, right, it's like these people, some of them are in their prime, like, oh my gosh, athlete, social media influencer, renowned pastor. So for many of these people, they're like on top of the game, right? But like the equalizer is the fragility of life, right? So for what the Institute of the Creative Dying says, it's like, okay, babes, no matter on what pedestal you be sitting on, like, there's one thing that is going to humble us all. And I wanted to speak a little about that, right? Sort of this meditation on morality, because oftentimes we think that we can buy ourselves time, right? But what I think the novel is trying to do is to say, babes, like, we are all fallible, right? We are all fragile to this thing called life, right? And so it's not immortality, it's actually mortality. We need to think about that. So I wanted to know about your meditations around that, right? Just like the equalizer that is dying, but also just the idea of the kind of fragility of life.
Yeah, I think it also stemmed from a lot of my mom's influence. Actually, she always reminds me like, stay grounded. You know, you can always be brought down to earth if need be. And growing up, I guess, with that, always that imposition, like no matter how much you achieve, you got to always stay grounded. You've got to always honor the relationships that have made you who you are. And I think for a lot of the characters, some of the characters, at least Angelique, when she rises to her fame, some of the relationships sort of suffer because of that. And part of her journey is kind of coming back to honoring the relationships that have made her, the network that has made who she thinks she is. And a lot of it was kind of, you could say, critiquing the kind of materialism that we are wrapped up in, that we build our lives on, that we build relationships with. But even that kind of materialism, or that sort of love of objects, love of things, it fades. Love of status, it fades, and that's part of the fading of many other things in the world as well, both the physical and the ideological. So yeah, I think with in terms of morality, how that translates in terms of morality, I think I wanted to, in people like the Tobias, for example, the pastor who scams his congregation, and Angelique, the social media person who kind of falls from grace. It's kind of, well, how do you, when you rise to the top, are you able to take a step back and still keep your head about you, honor the relationships that you've had from the start, and when you do get fame, if it happens for you, how do you allow it to change you? Because I do think our culture is obsessed with status, with fame, with consumption as it is. And I think part of me showing these characters in their weakest, in their vulnerable state, was trying to imagine a different way to relate to consumption, to status. I don't even know if I was successful in imagining a different way. I mean, it was very important for me that the characters weren't paying for this experience at the Institute, that it was something offered for free. Because I think having them pay would have kind of contaminated what I wanted the space to be, even though the history of that comes to the fore in the novel. I still wanted the morality to be trying to push outside of this capitalist hegemony, you could call it, or just capitalism itself, like consumption and love of objects. I wanted the Institute to be this kind of bubble, even though that bubble doesn't sustain for the novel. Yeah.
So I think it's interesting that you've said that, guys, because I think that particularly for the Mortician, for Babita, there is a blurring of the lines, right? And if there's anybody in the book who blurs the lines and it makes you feel morally conflicted, it's Babita, it's the Mortician. And I guess the real question for me is twofold, right? There's a conversation that comes to the fore around restitution, reconciliation, redemption, and reparations, right? And how far can one go to satisfy their own ideals, right? In that liminal space that's quite gray, right? Because what the Mortician does ultimately in her quest to get redemption is morally questionable, right? It is questionable how she obtains the space that's meant to, in many ways, be the face of like anti-capitalism, and it's like this place where people come to ascend to their higher self. But in her question, that she often just steps into that gray zone of questionability, even for Mustafa. And I wanted to know why it was important for you to write that particular conflict, because there's a conversation around reconciliation, reparations, restitution, and then moral ambiguity that I think that the reader is left with.
I think with the Mortician, it was kind of thinking about, well, there's so much kind of writing, about maybe the evils of capitalism, racialized capitalism, but how radical do you have to get to break a system? Kind of like how much do you have to push it? How morally gray do you have to go to be a revolutionary? And there's a line where she says, I'll paraphrase it, but for her as a character, revolution only can happen in those morally gray areas for someone like the Mortician, which is why she takes the opportunity to, you could say, manipulate her way into getting the funds. Definitely manipulate, actually.
It's not you. It is manipulation. Not even it's manipulation.
Yeah. Right. And I think it's kind of like thinking, well, what does it take to break a paradigm? Do we have to become morally ambiguous? And if we do, when do we know when to stop? And I think for the Mortician as a character, there's a sense where, okay, she's done this thing and the institute is running, but again, there's that ambition creeps in, that ambition to carry on what she started. And again, it was me kind of saying, well, okay, these people, for most of the novel, they represent themselves as these higher selves. They're always so detached, but even they can fall victim to a kind of ego. And it was a way for me to kind of also critique the same philosophies that I was drawing on, how people can use spirituality or these kind of philosophies as a way to detach from their commitment to other relationships, but also as a way to get their own ends, to meet their own ends, what they want to do. So the way in which ego can creep into a philosophy that's supposed to be trying to become egoless, and that was a way for me to show how it's such a tricky situation when you're trying to make something new. And there's moments where the reader can maybe get the sense that the institute itself falls into a kind of cult-like situations. So it was also interested in the fact that, okay, well, cults themselves, they're problematic, but where's that line where someone's trying something new, trying to maybe live in a commune, trying to create this utopian space, but then there's always these kind of power imbalances that usually turn these utopian spaces into oppressions or into cults or into, for example, in the book, surveillances that are problematic. Yeah.
I think there's a line that you speak to. Sorry. There's a line that you speak to, and for me, it's the line between, I guess it's the psychoactives or the substances that are used, and there's an interesting line between memory, so present and past, that I think often gets blurred. And it's interesting that, of course, the substances are the use for that. But I'm interested in memory as a tool in this particular setting, right? So what is memory as it's particularly at the end of life, right? We often see many of the characters return to previous versions of themselves and reimagine memories, right? And there's something very interesting for me about what it looks like to be ascending to your higher self, but in some ways also regressing to past memories or core memories.
I mean, to kind of highlight that, one of the, the memory part is really interesting because one of the characters reminds the first moment he discovered that he was queer, and the discovery of the queerness was kind of in this barbershop that he went to, and how the barber had a hard on, and he was like, oh, okay. And then realizing later on that, like, when the Baba said, Vashio Medi, that it's not that type of party, right? But
Yeah.
also just the interesting ways in which, like, kind of homoeroticness and queerness submerge itself, right? And I was thinking about, like, particularly, like, like, memories like play a really important role. Like Tobias, for instance, start thinking about Tobias, he starts thinking about all the dodgy stuff that he did and how he got to do the dodgy stuff, right? And so in many ways, like, it feels like these people are people are reflecting on memory, like Alma is saying, but some of them are kind of wanting to justify the actions that they made. So they're using memory as a way to be like, yeah, but there was no other way. So yeah, like this memory is
Mm.
quite interesting, and just your reflections on that.
Yeah, I think it also my interest in that was okay. Well, these people are they're away from the world. They're kind of cooped up for the most part. So I mean, what do you do when you are so isolated? What do you have to rely on? So at least the setting itself um, gave credence to the characters reflecting so much. But I do also think that when you are ill in the way that these characters are, um, time feels different when your body can't do what it usually can do. When you don't feel so vital, you don't have the sense of vitality anymore, and all you are kind of doing, especially for someone like Diane, is kind of just like sitting because you're so innovated and you have no energy. You time feels different. Sort of the day passes differently, and I think it gives you an opportunity to reflect, and to kind of really hone in on these memories, that that are anchors for some of the people, that are pivotal points, changing points in how they saw themselves, and the people that they related to. Um, also, because I was dealing with death, I think part of it is also dealing with the dissolution of self, and so much of the self is built on memory. So it was important for me to like rely on this archive of memory to establish the people, and then to have when death happens, you kind of lose all
Yeah.
that archive, right? You lose the archive, and sometimes that doesn't happen through death. Sometimes through Alzheimer's, people lose that archive, and they really become like a husk of themselves. So much of the self is not just memory, but how we remember, what we choose to remember. What sometimes it's not even up to us what we choose to remember. Sometimes your memory can be filled in by other people, and that totally changes how you saw yourself in that situation. So I think relying on memory and the way they try to control the way the memory, especially someone like Tobias, try to rationalize. It's also a way to try to rationalize his existence in the world.
Yeah.
In a way, it's definitely that. Um, yeah. So, but at the same time, like it's a slipperiness, right? And I think because it's so constructed by the characters, it also points to the slipperiness of memory, but also the slipperiness of self, which is what the Mortician and Mustafa are kind of trying to push for as well. The fact that you can try to let go of these memories. You can try to let go of these traumas, even though the letting go might not be completed. You can at least start the journey, to try and let go, to try and renegotiate the sense of self in new ways. Um, and in terms of the psychoactive substances, um, there's sort of research that's been done where it showed brain scans of shrooms, people's brains on shrooms, and it's been shown that it kind of heightens different neural networks that usually don't speak to one another. So I was interested in showing, especially in the shroom scene or scenes, these different connections that the characters are making that sometimes are too fast for them to really hold on to, but they're still drawing these kinds of this kind of meaning from them that feels so pertinent for their lives. So I was interested in showing those kind of many spiraled connections that these substances can produce in the brain as well.
One thing that I should also think that you do so powerfully in the book, which was really important for me, was this idea of pleasure and disability. I feel like oftentimes when people become disabled, what ends up happening is that people think that like pleasure, particularly sexual pleasure, is not something within the domain. And you kind of challenge that narrative in the book, right? And in a number of different ways. But I wanted to know why it was important for you to, I mean, it's for me, I will call it queering, because it does kind of that, the here and now is not enough, and let's think of different worlds. And in many ways, that's reimagining of different worlds. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? So kind of intimacy, disability, and also like, the kind of end of life type of thing, that the pleasures within that period.
And with Lucas and the disability that he runs into. So I mean, he's been an athlete. He's kind of invested in his body for so long, and his body has become a kind of status symbol for him in the queer community, and in his relationship. And it was kind of, for me, writing about, I guess, my own anxieties of the body, the fact that yes, you can be healthy and invest in your body and so much, but it is going to unravel itself at some point. And so where do you put your value of self when it does unravel? And for Lucas and Daniel, them experiencing, for Daniel experiencing depression, and for Lucas ending up in an accident that disables him to some extent, really affects their relationships, affects the way that they can be intimate with each other. So I was interested in those kind of weird moments when your body doesn't show up in the way you want it to show up in the sexual encounter, and how does a couple negotiate that. And oftentimes how the couple negotiates that says a lot about the underlying inhibitions or underlying insecurities that a couple has. And then also, funny enough, through the writing of the novel, it kind of fell on Lucas to be the narrating voice in times of probably the highest action point. I was like, oh, it just seems most natural that it should be Lucas at this point, because of where he is in the institute. So like, okay, well, let's lean into this. Let's write from Lucas's point, this high octane action moment. And that was also important for me to show that, yes, the body is kind of damaged in a weird way, but it also has all these other mobilities, all these other functions, right? The body can do many different things. And so often we're accustomed to, the X, Y, and Z of sort of a normative body, normative gestures. So it was in a weird way interesting for me, because I'm not someone who is disabled in the way Lucas is, to think about the choreography in that particular action scene of how someone would go about doing that, and to think of the choreography of or the process of rehabilitation that someone has to kind of. There's a line where Lucas speaks to his legs having their own amnesia, right? The muscle memory has kind of been knocked out. And so I was interested in the fact that, yes, so much of the self is sort of, we say it's in the mind, but the body itself has its own memory that can also be lost. And often, disability or injury in that sense is kind of dealing with the loss of that bodily memory. That was always in the back of your mind, kind of yourself, but you never associated that as yourself. So I was trying to say, well, all of this is yourself. Your heart beating is also yourself. The way your toes curl during orgasm, it's also yourself. All these different things. So it was kind of like trying to break down that barrier between mind and body. That was also part of my preoccupation as well in the novel.
I think it's interesting that the topic spoke to intimacy, because there's a non-romantic, so there's a platonic intimacy that you explore between quite a few of your characters. But I think that we also see the limits of that intimacy, right? And what can intimacy coexist in a skewed power dynamic or in a space where there are secrets? And I think that particularly in the relationship between the Mortician and Mustafa, that most clearly comes to the front, right? Because yes, they finish each other's sentences and they stand. I mean, there's a very poignant scene where they're at the robots and they complete each other's thoughts, and you think, oh, this is the most romantic friendship, right? But even in that intimacy, there's almost a space that they both cannot seem to transgress, and so much of that conflict lies in their inability to transverse the space. And I want to talk a little bit about how you wrote that particular relationship, but also then as a wider critique to say, are there spaces where intimacy cannot coexist with the very human state of being, right? To be deeply flawed is very human. To have contradictions in between your ideals and your behavior is deeply human. But can intimacy still reside in that space, and what would it look like?
Yeah. So when I was writing the Mortician and Mustafa, I wanted to write a kind of relationship that was extremely porous in the way that they showed up for one another, in the way that they were also physical with each other, but in a non-sexual way. In the way that they seem, for the most part, so aligned on so many different levels. But so often, because one of the kind of existential, kind of weird experiences of being human is that you are trapped in your own body, if you could put it that way. You're the only person that gets to experience your thoughts. And even though you may be so accustomed with someone and so friendly to the point where your partner is kind of completing your sentences, there's always going to be that barrier that you have to cross. But at the same time that this is a barrier that you have to cross, it's also a barrier that still always tempts you with, well, you don't have to tell that person this thing, they'll never know. And in that slow kind of that kind of side thought kind of recurring slowly creeps in, and then you hold back one thing, and that one thing becomes it adds on, and it becomes easier and easier. So I think for me it's kind of thinking about that boundary between two people. Yes, it's porous. Yes, it can be porous. Yes, it can be very beautiful and intimate, but that boundary also presupposes the possibility, or at least the temptation, that you don't have to always be so forthcoming, be so open. And I think it is an ideal, maybe even an impossible ideal, in terms of the Mortician and Mustafa's friendship, in the way I've written it, to be that open, because there's always that sense that you have to keep something for yourself, at least. Something has to be mine. I can't give this person everything. So there's a way, when I was writing that relationship, I was also thinking about the boundaries of friendship, and where do we get to draw the line? What do we keep for ourselves? And the repercussions of that, when what you keep for yourself is something so drastic that it shows the inherent misalignment in the way that the Mortician and Mustafa go about thinking up or organizing the institute. And it was important for me to show that both of them, it wasn't just the Mortician that was problematic, but also Mustafa that also falls victim to desire. And I think, both of them are desiring different things. So it is also thinking about how the force of desire itself can instill intimacy and constitute it and make it a beautiful thing, but can also destroy it. And so much of stories generally are about this double-edged sword of desire, that it makes things, but it also breaks things. That we're drawn to it, but we can also be repulsed by it. Yeah.
Do you? So I think that it's interesting that you're speaking about desire, because I think that the Mortician's desire is very clear, somewhat rooted in her ego, somewhat. I think that her ideals are of course, yes, they're altruistic, and yes, there are things that she wants to do, but they're also deeply rooted in her ego and her desire to restore or to fix what she may have felt that may have not been able to do with her parents. That's a whole like side conversation. Stay tuned for the podcast. But but I think that with Mustafa, I think it's interesting that you've spoken about desire, because in many ways Mustafa also wants to fix, and there's almost a commentary around the arrogance of believing that you are in a position as flawed, as deeply flawed, and as human as you are, to believe that you can fix others, that you can heal. I mean, there's a line where he says, instead of healing their relationship, he added to its breaking, and I think that is so characteristic of almost the savior complex that Mustafa has. That in many ways is also just having not done the internal work, or having done it superficially, right? And I want to speak a little bit about that, because I find Mustafa to be quite an interesting character. But there's something about the desire to constantly fix that I think you're making a commentary on, right? This idea that it's also very much a social media thing, right? So we're always like psychoanalyzing each other. Like if you do one thing, or you and your partner do one thing, that's a trauma bond, right? And we're all like on TikTok, that's the trauma bonding. But there's a commentary there around the desire to fix that in many ways is also broken, that I'm very interested in.
And yeah, also in some sense, the desire to fix can also be seen as a desire to control, to shape things to the way that you think they should be shaped, and it's I guess part of the ambiguity of their own positions in a place that's trying to get these people to transcend, to let go, whereas they themselves are attached to, for example, Mustafa trying to save or trying to fix people. But so much. I mean, with Mustafa trying to sort of consciously fix things, consciously fix relationships. Was also part of, I guess, part of me questioning, well, how much, first of all, is in your control, and how do you deal with so much that is not in your control, and how does the desire to fix and the kind of obsession or attachment to fixing end up destroying as well. So it was always, when writing these characters, is always about thinking about what are they attached to, and how what is that tension, how are they both trying to push it away but also being drawn to it in a weird way. Yeah, for Mustafa, I mean, Mustafa was one of my favorite characters, probably my favorite character, I think, which is why the novel ends with him. I think I think I do have an attachment to Mustafa. And I mean, with the savior complex, I think he realizes near the end that he can only do so much. I mean, we do see him have these sort of charitable acts and do these charitable things, and even he himself wonders, like, how far will this go? Like, how there's this line of him saying, "How do I keep my heart open in hell?" Like, how far does one charitable action actually go? And he holds to these ideals, but he's not sure how effective they can be, even though he knows that, his metaphysics leads to a kind of ethics where every person must be seen and helped. But sometimes, the limitation that he experiences kind of upshores him, or kind of makes him feel that he's not being effective as he could be, or the way he values himself kind of depreciates that. But I also think as part of, because Mustafa he comes from, he's an orphan. He was raised in an orphanage. And I think it was also part of me thinking about, okay, well, this orphan person had to come up with a world that maybe wasn't so conventional. I didn't want to kind of write the trope of the orphan that hated the world. So I wanted to think, okay, what if there was an orphan that wanted to save the world, that wanted to, try something new and innovate in a weird way. because of their life experience and want to make things better because he himself has always been neglected. So sometimes the savior complex can be quite a violent experience. I mean, with Lucas, I think Mustafa would think that, you know, he was saving Lucas in some way by showing him that he could be loved in the way that he wanted to be. But even that, you know, that kind of act of saving can be quite violent, can be destructive. So I think when you're trying to save someone, I think it's not always positive. It's not always clear cut that saving someone is going to lead to all these other positive effects.
Also, I don't know how Daniel felt about Lucas being saved and loved by Mustafa.
Yeah.
That's just me being spicy because I felt for my homie Daniel.
For Daniel.
I had a very soft spot for him.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, really?
I did. The book is out in the world now, right? So, like, you know, whatever musings you had when you were writing, anxiety and all of that are out. What do you hope the book will do, right? You know, this being your debut and an ambitious debut at that. What do you hope your readers or someone who picks up the book takes away from it? What are the dreams you have about, or what metaphysical thing the book can do?
I mean, in my life experience, there've been a handful of books that have altered the way I felt about the world, that have at least taught me something about human relationships, or given me ideas to play around with, or offered me avenues for further reading, or have incited me to look at the world maybe from a different angle. And those books I've always cherished them, but also books that have offered affirmation of my own queerness, my own way I see the world, and offered not only a reflection but a kind of journey through my own queerness as well. Books that have allowed me to see other sides of myself, even sides I may not want to affirm or proclaim, but sides of myself in other characters. So I think if the book can shift readers, you know, on the axis, even for just a degree, you know, whether it's taking something from the story about human relationships or inciting them to read more about psychedelic therapy, for example. If they could sort of metabolize the book and take, you know, what resonates for them, I think that's the only thing I can hope for, because it is read by so many people. So if the book is able to be sort of metabolized and taken for both its entertainment value, hopefully, but also for the kind of questions, the kind of curiosities that it's trying to instill in the people at the institute, then maybe it can, you know, instill curiosities in other people, and will, you know, have other people wondering, well, what if I can design how I want to die? What if I do want to go try this retreat somewhere, to work on myself in different ways that are outside of maybe religious institutions, for example. So if it sparks curiosity and an interest in these ideas and a further exploration of these kind of ideas, then I'd be happy. Yeah.
And I guess, you know, just to potentially expand a little bit on that, I think at the beginning you said that you wrote this book at a time where you were exploring, you know, different belief systems, but you're also working through particular ideas around mortality, around death, around dying, but also around the physical. And I guess maybe just in closing is to hear how writing this book has changed particular beliefs for you. I think that there are lots of meditations that the Mortician and Mustafa bring on some of the questions that we posed earlier on, right at the beginning. And I'm curious about how writing this book has changed your own beliefs.
Yeah. I think it's. I think when I had started out listening to people like Ram Dass and Alan Watts, I think I was very enamored and very taken with the ideas that they were discussing. And I think in the writing of this book, it and just I mean in a nutshell, those ideas are basically kind of like letting go of the ego, drawing on Buddhist beliefs of sort of desire and detachment. And writing the book, it kind of showed me, well, when you're in relationships, the saying is easier than doing. That it's always messy and sticky, and you're always going to trip up and get caught up, and that it's never kind of final nirvana moment. The nirvana moment's always postponed, and there's like little glimpses of it, and then you lose it. But the losing of it doesn't necessarily mean that it's sort of fictitious, so it's not there. I think the moments that you do feel that are moments that are real and are moments that can change you. And I think it's how you choose to remember those moments and integrate those moments and what you draw from that moment as well. And so what the book has taught me is that it's way more complicated in human relationships when you try to imagine a kind of utopia or imagine a kind of utopian vision of the world or the way to see the world. But it's also reminded me that even though we can abstract the world in this way, we can show that everything's nature is vibrant and your body is vibrant, and you're just going to be absorbed into the vibrancy of the cosmos. That doesn't mean it's not scary. That doesn't mean it's not terrifying to give up this self that you've at times hated, you've at times loved, you've at times pushed beyond its boundaries. So I think it's showed me that there's so much more ambiguity than just putting the full stop and like, okay, this is the book and this is what everyone should believe. And I don't think that, I think the kind of meditations in this book, like 10 years from now, I might read it and kind of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I was writing that right now. But I think that's part of the process. I think that's part of the shedding that at least books allow you to do. You can shed yourself completely in a book and then read it a decade from now. I'm like, oh, okay, I see the husk of myself there. Yeah.
I like that, but I also like the fact that you are not going to be the same person in 10 years, and so maybe you might cringe or you might feel differently about the book. But that's the beauty of evolution in many instances, right? And kind of something that you also explore in the book, kind of these people thinking, oh, I'm not who I was like 5 years ago. I'm not who I was before this thing that happened. But Jarred, we just want to thank you from the Cheeky Natives. This has really been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for everyone who's joining us on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. It's been, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, not Instagram as yet. But thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk about the Institute of Creative Dying, which is an absolutely brilliant debut novel, and we really encourage people to pick it up. If you want a copy, perhaps what you should do is just DM us and say, hey, I'd like to be hooked up with the Institute of Creative Dying. And perhaps what we might do is, because we are in buddies with Jarred, is get you signed copies. So please definitely come DM us and let us know that you'd like the book. We think that it's absolutely something to pick up. Dr. A?
Definitely for me. Thank you so much, Jarred. This has been such a beautiful conversation. I think that it's interesting because Cook and I are having this conversation just around some of the themes in the book, and I think that you've explored really difficult themes with nuance, with tenderness and with vulnerability, and that is a feat on its own. So even if in 10 years you look back and think, oh, really? What is that? I think that the triumph will be in the tenderness and the vulnerability and the way in which you stretched the reader's imagination, and that itself is a triumph. So thank you so much, Jarred. And thank you to all of our Cheeky Natives and to our baby Cheeky, who is now on the scene. But thank you so much, everybody. And We are super excited to see all of you on Saturday. Stay tuned to our socials for all the information around our event with Lebohang Masango. And thank you so much to Jarred.
Thank you both for holding the space for me and for asking these insightful questions. I always say after every interview, I always feel like I see the book in a new way, and I see a different side of the book. So thank you for offering me a new side of my work. So thank you.
Wonderful. Everyone, we're going to be off until next time, but definitely see you on Saturday at 12 p.m. All right. Bye, everyone.